On Commons People this week, Labour contenders are whittled down.
We cannot fight the Tories if we're fighting each other. Factionalism has to go.
Brexit battle lines are drawn.
You always have to budget for a complete failure of common sense.
And just what is Johnsonism?
Well, it's not for government to step in and save companies that simply run into trouble.
Hello and welcome to Commons People. I'm Arj Singh and joining me this week is Paul Waugh.
Hi Arj.
Hey Paul, we've also got Rachel Wearmouth.
Hello.
And we've got the Labour MP Stephen Kinnock.
Hello. Hi.
How are you doing, Stephen?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Enjoying the leadership campaign?
Yeah, I am actually. I think it's been really good. And I'm obviously a big Team Lisa person. Lisa Nandy, I think, has been doing a great job so far, really making waves.
Cool. Well, yes, the leadership candidates were narrowed down to 5 this week after Clive Lewis dropped out the race and Emily Thornberry scraped through to the next stage after MPs made their nominations. Lisa Nandy is making a lot of the early running and won plaudits for her performance in an interview with notoriously tough BBC politics veteran Andrew Neil. Here is Nandy taking on Neil.
What possible approach to the EU could unite Hampstead and Hull?
I think opposition to a hard Brexit and a better vision of where Britain sits in the world. One of the things that I set out today was the lack of thinking that we've done on the left about what a commitment to internationalism now means. Let me give you an example of this.
But I'm talking about the EU and how you would approach and unite Hampstead and Hull. I want to concentrate on what your attitude to the EU could be that would unite these two areas.
Could I just gently say to you that if you don't want me to talk in generalities, you are going to have to give me time to answer the question. And that will take more than one sentence, because reuniting Hampstead and Hull that have been moving apart for 40 years
Exactly,
takes
and I'm
more than a
asking you what would bring them together.
Paul, Nandy was impressive, wasn't she? But can she win?
That's a big question. I wrote a piece earlier this week about the fact that what she's got going for her is that she's the only candidate you can see any real growth in support for. You kind of know roughly where Long Bailey and Starmer's support is, and Jess is out on her own, and Thornberry, as much as, you know, it was nice to see her get in the final runoff. And I was actually there when Afzal Khan gave her that magic domination, and the relief was amazing for her, very palpable. Despite that, it seems that Nandy's the only one who actually can build support in terms of momentum. The big question is, how well known is she? I mean, the Andrew Neil programme was really interesting because I thought, you know, that's a test that every candidate should try and pass. There's no question. We're not trying to build up Andrew Neil into this great bit of the British Constitution. You know, he has to interview the Prime Minister and he has to interview the Labour leader. But, you know, it's the kind of tough questioning that you're going to get. And unfortunately, it's not the kind of tough questioning we've seen people do well at in recent years. So the Nandy camp, I mean, Stephen knows this better than anyone else, has got this sort of preferential strategy, which is she's a lot of people's second choice. And that's great. I mean, you even saw it in this poll that was put out last night by Labour List and Survation. Even though she was only on 7%, which looks terrible, she was a lot of people's second choice. Big thing for her is getting into second place. If she could therefore get into second place and all the second preferences, then she can win. She could beat Starmer. Or even Long Bailey. The really interesting question is how she gets there. And don't forget, the whole point of this contest is it's MPs first, then it goes out to members and affiliates. The reason it's MPs first, people forget, and the reason it's always been MPs first, is because they know MPs almost better than anyone else. They've seen them up close, they've seen them in the chamber, they've seen them not in the chamber, they've seen them privately, personally. So you have that sifting mechanism, which is actually quite valuable. The Tories use it brilliantly, let's be honest, to get leaders that can get them into power. Because the people who know them best are not necessarily the people who've just seen a bit in the paper or a bit online, as a party member might do. And so that's why I think it is quite interesting that Lisa Nandy came third amongst the MPs. She's impressed a lot of them, she impressed me in the hustings. And the hope is, on her camp's point of view, that if she does that similarly impressive performance at every hustings, then maybe the members will the penny will begin to drop.
Yes, Stephen, as you said, you're a supporter of Lisa. The polls aren't great for her at the moment. How does she climb up to second place or even first place?
I think those polls are mainly about visibility. They are about name recognition. And of course, people have a higher name recognition for Keir and Rebecca. They've been in the shadow cabinet for the last few years. Keir has had a very prominent role in the whole Brexit debate. So what we're seeing is that people are more aware of Rebecca and Keir, but the more they get to know Lisa, the more they like what they see. So I think a huge part of this is maximum media exposure, and we saw with the Andrew Neil interview how well she does. The hustings, I think, are going to be key, getting her up next to Keir and Rebecca, and if she performs as she did in the PLP hustings, she will win those hustings. She clearly won the PLP hustings. I know I'm biased in this, but I think most commentators agreed, and most MPs
were non-aligned afterwards,
yeah.
and they agreed.
Yeah, she smashed the PLP hustings. So we're seeing great potential there. The question is, will we be able to get her out to members across the country? And I think one of the big advantages that Lisa has is that we're making that argument for turning the page. We've got to learn the lessons of what happened up to the 12th of December, the absolute disaster of that election result. And, you know, I think we've got great candidates. I've got huge respect for Keir and Rebecca and Emily, but they were in that shadow cabinet. They were around the table when so many of those key decisions were made. Candidates such as Lisa and Jess are very much coming from the backbenches, turning the page. We need a new chapter, and it's much more difficult for people who are in the shadow cabinet to make that argument.
Yeah, Rachel, you caught up with Jess Phillips last night. What do you make of her chances?
Well, I guess you'd describe Jess Phillips as the moderate or the Blairite candidate, which rules her out for a lot of people in the party that she would need to convince, might rule her out for a lot of unions as well. I think what she does have, like Stephen was saying about Lisa, is she's got a lot of name recognition, so she's not doing as badly as you might expect in some polls. But I was chatting to her last night, and she did say that she's seen in the media as like, and these are her words, as like a Blairite devil. But she's actually having a better response from members than that, because she's got this big social media following, and she's got a different, more direct relationship with some members. But she's going to struggle to get affiliates to back her. However, her team was quite confident of getting enough CLPs on side to get through to the next round. So she could be surprising, but again, the hustings will be key for Jess as well, I think.
Yeah, on this Blairite thing, the new Labour MP Zara Sultana said, I think yesterday, used her maiden speech to say that Blair had helped preside over 40 years of Thatcherism. What do you make of that, Stephen?
I just am so disappointed when I hear those comments. It is a gift to the Conservatives. And what utter nonsense. From 97 to 2010, we lifted millions out of poverty. We delivered the minimum wage. We created Sure Start, peace in Northern Ireland, devolution, huge achievements. You know, the Labour Party is the greatest force for good that British politics has ever seen. And if you don't believe that and understand that, then I think you've just got completely the wrong end of the stick. So I'm always very disappointed when I hear those things. Yes, we didn't get everything right between 97 and 2010. Certainly things like the Iraq War, you know, I would never have supported that if I had been an MP at the time. And I think we could have done more for our industrial communities and have a real industrial strategy that addressed the structural problems in the British economy, not just the cyclical ones. But fundamentally, if you look at the balance sheet, we achieved a tremendous amount between 97 and 2010, and every time Labour colleagues make those kind of comments, they are simply handing a big gift to the Conservative Party.
That was why it was strange, I thought, actually, to see Angela Rayner retweeting that speech and saying, excellent speech. I mean, what's going on there, do you think, Stephen? I mean, surely Angela Rayner, of all people, she's publicly said, look, without Tony Blair's Sure Start, I wouldn't be where I am today.
She's kind of a unity figure, isn't she?
You know, she actually knows that a Labour government has actually made a difference. And I found that very odd. I don't know if that's Angela just trying to tack too much towards that sort of momentum bit of the party. I don't know.
I mean, you'd have to ask Angela herself. I've got a lot of respect for Angela in terms of what she's achieved in the education brief, and you know, she has an amazing backstory. But I think it's a really bad idea to trash the legacy. We shouldn't just blindly talk like zombies about how excellent everything was between 97 and 2010, but to trash the legacy is a completely unnecessary thing to do. And it's also, I mean, let's move forward. Let's have a leadership election now, which isn't so much about pinning labels on people. Are you a Blairite? Are you a Corbynite? Let's actually start talking about pulling the party back together and the country back together. And the more we tweet and retweet and make speeches which are divisive in that way in terms of faction here and faction X and faction Y, the more it's going to be very, very difficult for whoever wins this leadership contest to move forward, because what we don't want to have is a leadership contest that is going to end up wounding the person who wins in the process. So far, the leadership candidates, I think, I think it's been a really refreshing debate. People have been robust, but they've also been very respectful of each other, and it has been outward-looking and future-facing. And I really think that that's the spirit, and I hope that every single member of the Parliamentary Labour Party will take a leaf out of the candidate's book.
We've gone back to Blair. I hope you won't mind if we go back a few more years to your dad, Neil Kinnock.
Oh, right, now that's really going back. Yeah.
Do you think any candidate who wins this Labour leadership election could have a Neil Kinnock type of role to play, given the Tories are so far ahead?
We've certainly got an uphill struggle, and of course the big difference now is Scotland. You know, even things were awful in 1983, but we still had Scotland. I agreed with the Prime Minister when he said that those who voted Tory in our so-called red wall seats were only lending their vote because of Brexit, because of our, in my opinion, deeply mistaken and foolhardy idea of backing a second referendum, which we were crippled by the Corbyn leadership, and then the second referendum kind of finished the job. Now, we're moving on from that. We need to make sure we move on from it in a way which also recognises the mistakes we've made, acknowledges those mistakes, shows that we can listen and rebuild trust in those communities. And that's why I'm backing Lisa Nandy, because I think she's so far ahead of the rest in terms of being able to do that. So those votes are there for the taking. We can win them back. And as Lisa said in her speech in Dagenham, her launch speech, she said, the road back to victory is steep, but it doesn't have to be long. But it's all about having the right leader in place who will say and do the right things in that first 6 months of their tenure. So I think we could well start to rebuild in a very similar way to what my father did between 83 and 87. But it really does require having the right leader with the right understanding of the fundamental challenges that we face.
And do you think, actually, Stephen, that actually the new leader needs to do what your dad did in terms of really focusing on kicking out extremists within the party? Not just anti-Semites, but people whose values are simply not on the same page as the Labour Party. They're that far out. I mean, do you think that's got to be gripped?
I think there's an anti-Labour left which has actually infiltrated our party. And that's the test. Is this member of the Labour Party, somebody who has signed up, who's managed to get their membership card, are they really Labour? Or are they part of a sort of Marxist sect? Is there a whiff of anti-Semitism about them? And we have to be absolutely ruthless on that and kick that out. I do also believe, though, that there is some very, very positive energy there in organisations like Momentum, in terms of a lot of people who've joined because they want to do grassroots campaigning, because they want to get out and save their local bus stop, save their local library, do that community organising, which is in the DNA of the Labour Party. So I think it's really important that the new next leader doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's take the best of what we've seen with the surge in membership and creating a kind of national movement for progress in our country. But let's also be much smarter about identifying people who actually have a very different agenda, which is about undermining the Labour Party, deselecting good MPs, and just not being helpful at all in terms of training, aiming our fire, if you like, at who we really need to be opposing here, which is the Conservative Party, the old enemy.
Rachel Paul, you're the Labour expert on the HuffPost team. Why isn't Rebecca Long-Bailey doing better among Momentum and Labour? I think a couple of months ago, you guys were both saying she looks. Well, that poll last night shows that she's still a force to be reckoned with. There's no question. It's got a big health warning, that poll. It was self-selecting.
it was people who got identified as Labour members, and Labour list readers, the website it was drawn from, are not necessarily representative of the whole of the Labour Party. So there's a lot of health warnings. But nevertheless, her team will be really pleased that she's ahead of Starmer, even by a few points. And it does underline that, as Stephen said, she's got a profile within the party. I think, personally, outside the party, she's had zero profile. I think very, very few members of the public actually know many of these candidates. They might even just about recognise Keir Starmer, but that's in question. So we're talking about within the Labour Party. I think definitely she's got a profile. There's that point about being continuity Corbyn, although she hates the tag, actually it's quite useful to her because it's an instant brand. And if it does come down to a simple choice, well, do you want to keep something of Corbynism or do you want a proper break? Then people might just say, well, I want to keep something that's close to him. So, yeah, but we say she's done badly in the race. Don't forget, that's only in terms of Starmer doing the MPs bit. We'll yet to see more polls, I think, and let's see how she does in the hustings, as Stephen says. The hustings is a really, really important test of any politician. And it's quite reassuring, this modern age, actually, of Twitter and everything else, that actually what you say in a debate really does still matter.
Well, whoever's the new Labour leader is going to have to deal with Brexit, and Boris Johnson's deal has sailed through the Commons with little trouble in the last week. What a difference an election makes. But battle lines are already being drawn for the next stage of negotiations when it looks like the EU will try to get the UK to sign up to all sorts of regulations as part of a so-called level playing field. British MEPs are meanwhile packing up to leave Europe. Here's one, the Brexit Party's Nigel Farage.
After 3.5 years of deception and dishonesty, we will be leaving this prison of nations at the end of January. And we won't become a third country, as I've been hearing this morning. No, we're going to become an independent, self-governing nation. And you can delude yourselves this morning inside this cathedral that all is well, but it isn't. It isn't. People do not want to be run and governed by faceless bureaucrats like Michel and von der Leyen. Did you hear them earlier? Dull as ditch water. You're being rejected. And it's great news that in Poland, opinion polls now show a majority of Poles think they'd be better off outside the European Union. Brexit is the beginning of the end of this project. We are giving leadership, and we'll take it to a Europe of sovereign states working together, being friends together, but not being run by the gang down at the middle there.
Paul, Farage called Michel Barnier and Ursula von der Leyen dull as ditch water, but don't they hold all the cards in the next stage of negotiations?
I don't think they do hold all the cards, because at the end of the day, we've got a Prime Minister who's just got a massive majority. So the landscape's changed in that sense, in terms of his political power. So on the one level, they're really pleased that actually they've got someone they can finally deal with whose word will really matter, and he can do what he says, unlike Theresa May, At the same time, it sounds like the rhetoric from number 10 is he's not bluffing about this whole thing about he doesn't want an extension, so there won't be an extension. So whatever deal we come up with before the end of the year has got to be done. The big question, and it's a totally unresolved one, is what kind of Brexit it is, and how aligned or non-aligned it is. And we've been talking about this before, but those Tory MPs in the Red Wall, how hard a Brexit do they want? Are they listening to their local businesses, or are they maybe listening to their local constituents still? Many of whom actually were happy with the idea of no deal. Now, you might say they're misguided, it's not in their own self-interest if their local factory goes down, but a lot of them were so determined to have Brexit that, it sounded like, well, we're going to have our own Brexit. I remember talking to, last night even, talking to one of those Tory MPs from one of those seats, I said, how do you square this? Everyone assumes you're somehow going to be pressuring the Prime Minister to sort of back off and have a soft Brexit because it will really help manufacturing to have alignment. And one of the Tory MPs said to me, no, that's not what we're going to do. We want total maximum divergence because we want to raise workers' standards, we want to raise environmental standards, we think we can be world leaders. Now, you might say it's pie in the sky, but that's what they think.
You don't need to diverge to do that.
Well, no, I know, but they think they can have their own separate standards and somehow it can mirror the EU's.
Yeah.
Whether that's pie in the sky, we'll see.
Yeah, Stephen, what do you reckon? What type of Brexit do you think we might end up with? And you've done a lot of work on before the election and before Boris Johnson took over, trying to find an optimum Brexit as well. What do you think we might end up with under Boris Johnson, and what do you think maybe Labour should now argue for?
I think, I think that the political rhetoric, I agree with Paul, the political rhetoric coming out of Number 10 and the entire Conservative Party almost comprehensively now is that they want to diverge. I don't think the levels of understanding of what that means are anything like as high as the levels of the rhetoric that we're hearing. Because they keep saying, well, there'll be no tariffs and quotas through a free trade agreement. But that is also actually conditional on convergence. The EU has made it absolutely clear that if there is divergence on industrial product standards, on environmental standards, consumer standards, workers' rights, state aid provisions, they will use tariffs and quotas. So there seems to be a complete lack of understanding of the cost of divergence. And then, of course, it's not just the very clear transactional cost in terms of pounds, shillings and pence. It's also the huge administrative cost of the additional paperwork and bureaucracy that businesses will have to go through. So it's very easy indeed to have this throwaway comment about we're going to take back control of our money laws and borders and it's going to be all about divergence. I don't think the British business community is anything like as comfortable as the Conservative Party is with that rhetoric. And I think over the coming months we're going to see a number of key business leaders looking on with horror as we see this divergence policy being pushed through and realizing what it's actually going to cost. And that will then translate into jobs. I mean, I think that as you said, Aj, I've been advocating a closely aligned Brexit. I've always felt that 52-48 was a mandate to move house but stay in the same neighbourhood. And that is based on a very basic recognition, which is that the European Union is a regulatory superpower. And whether we like it or not, we are in the orbit of that superpower just because of geography. There are 500 million consumers on our doorstep, and our businesses rely on access to those consumers in a frictionless way. So whichever way you cut it, it's going to cost you to diverge from that. And I think there's been such a lack of honesty about the trade-offs that come with divergence. And now, I mean, the bizarre thing about the last 3 years is there's been a huge amount of heat and light about it, but by far the most important chapter in the Brexit story is about to start, by far the most important.
But it's going to be interesting, isn't it, with Boris Johnson's 80-seat majority, because stuff might be going to hell in a handcart in the negotiations, and actually we probably won't see the kind of political chaos how can it be stopped if it's going the wrong way? What can you do, really?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. It can't be. And they've even removed from the withdrawal bill the ability of Parliament to be consulted on key stages of the negotiations, the negotiating mandate and sign-off, etc. So Parliament has essentially been sidelined. So this one-nation Prime Minister keeps talking about wanting a one-nation Conservative Party, is completely removing Parliament, has removed the provisions around child refugees, and it has sort of just gone hell for leather in one particular direction, rather than, I think, trying to have an approach to Brexit which could actually reunite our deeply divided country.
We saw a little hint, Rachel, of the kind of flip side of this, which is the trade deals we'll be looking to do with other countries in terms of what wasn't in the agriculture bill.
Yeah, so this is kind of, farming community is very worried about this. The new bill does not include a binding commitment on food standards for imports. So that could speak to, in the future, sort of the chlorinated chicken from a US-UK trade deal, or hormone-treated beef, our farmers kind of being undercut with foreign imports. But at the same time, I know we've been talking about the sort of all will have cake strategy that Boris Johnson still has post-election. We had the Environment Secretary, Theresa Villiers, saying, this won't happen, we won't have any chlorinated chicken. This is absolute no from me. But you have a sort of US negotiators already saying that's not realistic. So
we'll see if she's there in post anyway at the end of the month or early next month.
We'll definitely do a reshuffle special or two in a couple of weeks.
The other key thing on it is that the Tories keep saying, well, we're already so integrated that it's not like another trade deal which is starting from zero and building up. But the EU's policy on this is, it's not where you are on the 1st of January 2021, It is the fact that once you get to the 1st of January 2021 and you have the right to diverge, you will be treated as if you've diverged. That's another part of this whole debate that has not been explored properly at all. It's not about disintegrating in that way. It's about as soon as you have the right to diverge, you will be treated as a third country, no matter where you are in terms of the alignment. So if the Tories' negotiating strategy is all about winning the right to diverge, that's all it's going to take for the barriers to come up.
I just wanted to ask you about something Lisa Nandy said last night and yesterday, which she launched a pretty spirited defence of free movement. Now, when you were drawing up your own Brexit plans, you recognised that you did have to reform or end free movement if we left the EU. Are you concerned that Labour is going to end up going into a position where, even under Lisa Nandy, your favoured leadership candidate, where it could be backing free movement?
I mean, in a sense, it's a discussion that's going to be led by the government, because if they're going to push through this points-based system, we're not in the driving seat.
So you're saying it to the members to get in, and then it doesn't matter by the time?
No, I'm just trying to give a bit of context in terms of my thinking on all of this, which is that this is going to be more about holding the government to account on their points-based system and making sure that it's fair and humane, and is also responding to the needs of our economy, and also responding to the need to ensure that we have strong and cohesive communities. I think that's where Lisa's coming from, in the sense of she wants those outcomes, an economy that works for everyone, and integrated and cohesive communities. My view is that the free movement of Labour was a problem in that sense, because people did feel that it was having an impact, particularly in areas where there was a surge, and that had an impact on that sense of cohesion in certain communities. And I think that it's right that we campaign for a system that is fair and humane, and is also where people trust the system, and that there is regulation in the system, because if you have a system that isn't trusted by the public, nobody wins from that. Those people coming into the country don't win, because they're treated with more suspicion and resentment. The economy doesn't benefit from that, because you can end up with a race to the bottom on terms and conditions, and the only people who actually benefit are unscrupulous employers. So there's no benefit from all of that. I think when Lisa is talking about free movement of labour, she is saying it has to be married with really cracking down hard on employers who don't pay the minimum wage, really cracking down on strengthening our trade unions so they've got more collective bargaining and that they can protect terms and conditions. So I think my reading of what Lisa is saying, you have to ask her this yourself, is, well, yes to being open to immigration which adds value to our society and to our economy, no to having an immigration system which just enables undercutting and a race to the bottom.
Realistically, are any of the Labour leadership candidates going to say we need to end free movement?
I don't know. It's a really tricky tightrope to walk down, isn't it? Because it's very difficult, particularly within the Labour Party. I thought Lisa Nandy did a pretty good job of trying to explain how you can be pro-migration, but at the same time accept you've got to respond to concerns of people in those communities who, for whatever reason, have a perception that immigration might harm them. And it's often a perception, not a reality. But she made a good point, which is actually you need to look even deeper than that and say, well, what was the real cause for their insecurity about their jobs and everything else? And it's a case that Corbyn tried to make, but didn't make it that convincingly in the election. So maybe it's just a question of a better communicator, but certainly it's got to be ramming home this fundamental point that she made again last night, and she said to us before, is if you're a working class woman in somewhere like Wigan and you're told all the time by the Remainers, look, we've got to keep free movement because we need nurses from Spain, and you're at the same time, your government is saying, actually, we're going to remove the chance for you to become a nurse by removing the nurses' bursary. No wonder you think these people are talking a different language. And I thought that was one of the most powerful points she's been making. And that, in a nutshell, has been the problem with Brexit. And no one's been saying that properly.
Away from Brexit, Boris Johnson's first month has also given us some clues as to where this Tory government is heading. The PM has had to walk a tightrope between allying with the US or Europe on the Iran crisis, and he's intervened to bail out the failing airline Flybe in the name of boosting the regions. Johnson has also caused some confusion earlier this week on the Iran nuclear deal, which Britain officially supports. Here he is.
The problem with the agreement is that from the American perspective, it's a flawed agreement, it expires, plus it was negotiated by President Obama, and it has, from their point of view, it has many, many faults. Well, if we're going to get rid of it, let's replace it, and let's replace it with the Trump deal.
Okay.
That's what we need to see. And I think that would be a great way forward. President Trump is a great deal maker, by his own account, and many others. Let's work together to replace the JCPOA and get the Trump deal instead.
Paul, what are your early impressions of Johnsonism, as we've dubbed it in the office?
You know what? What's really worrying for Labour is if Johnsonism works out, Labour could be out of power for quite a while, because Johnsonism in some ways takes a bit of everything. It takes a bit of Blairism. We've seen it this week. Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime was parroted at cabinet level by every single cabinet minister. The PM went round the room and said every department should be a criminal justice department. And by that he meant you should be looking at the causes of crime, as well as this whole agenda about being tough on crime. Very Blairite. Is a dollop of Brownism, a lot of Mandelsonism, you might say, regional investment, investing in skills, putting the money, almost like seed funding for various areas. He's ahead of the game on science and tech. There's no question, thanks to Dominic Cummings. It's something that Labour should be ahead of, but isn't. He's nowhere at the race. I mean, a good example of that is my son, who's a 19-year-old, during the last general election said, "What's Labour's policy on R&D?" And he said, "It looks like they're going to be cutting capital for R&D because of this other stuff, but the Tories are going to put more money into science. What's going on?"
You've got a very smart 18-year-old son.
He's a very smart. He's into science and everything else.
Chip off the old
And I struggled to tell him. I said, "Well, looks like the Tories have got a better policy. They're putting more money on science, and that's a forward-looking agenda that Johnson is quite smart on. You might even argue his stuff on gigabit broadband is actually more realistic than what Labour was offering last time. So the thing is, Johnsonism looks like it's mopping up everything else. And at the same time, you saw it really when he was the Mayor of London, at the same time as he did a lot of the stuff like supporting kids in poor areas through various schemes when he was in London, pumping money into bits of public transport. He also kept the council taxes low, and tried to persuade the sort of right of the party, or the free market bit of the party. Actually, he wasn't a spendthrift. And so it's really difficult. He's this target that moves, and it's hard to shoot a moving target, and I think for an opposition that's quite tough.
And what about on foreign affairs, though? We've just seen Boris Johnson talking about a Trump deal to replace the Iran nuclear deal. He's got a difficult balancing act there.
Well, again, I hate to say it, I'm not sounding like an apologist for Boris Johnson, as we keep calling him, not Boris Johnson.
I think we're over that.
I got fined for saying Boris too many times before. I hate to sound like an apologist for him, but this week, it sounds crass, him saying, "I want a Trump deal," and it sounds like he's bending over backwards to give whatever Trump wants on Iran. But there is a method in that madness, which is, if you say to Trump, "Can you come up with a deal, please? I think you're a brilliant negotiator."
And then you're not Barack Obama.
Yeah, and you're not Barack Obama. And you're pushing him towards negotiation, some kind of negotiation. That's a big win. If it ever happens, the problem is it's not happened so far since he floated this at the UN last year. Trump hasn't. But Trump tweeted this week, "Yeah, good idea. Thanks, Boris." Now, if there's any real beef in that, and Trump does tell his diplomats, could you actually come up with some kind of plan? Then you never know. The Iranians certainly don't want anything that's a non-diplomatic solution. They're sick of sanctions, and they're certainly not in the mood for war, obviously, given their own situation. So, again, Johnsonism might work out on the face of it. And I think Labour's big problem is to do what Emily Thornberry has been doing, which is just to focus all on the "you are Trump's poodle." And if you do that, and you do that for several years, it might make you feel good. But what if at the end of the day, somehow Trump defies people, as he did originally on North Korea? It hasn't lasted, but on North Korea, people were surprised. Well, actually, maybe this guy isn't as bonkers as he seems.
Yeah, are you worried, Stephen, by Johnsonism?
I think on foreign policy, Paul's right that the way to be an opposition on foreign policy is to be robust but constructive. And when a massively important action like the assassination of Soleimani takes place and you don't even get a phone call, I do think it's the opposition's job to say, well, British lives are actually at stake here, and it is outrageous that our so-called special relationship ally has done this without even informing us in advance. But I agree that it would not be the right way to go to just kind of constantly harangue about that. And of course, our interest is in building peace in the Middle East, in that desperately troubled area of the world. But I also think there's been real mixed signals on it, because Boris Johnson came out and said Trump deal, and then Dominic Raab had to come to the dispatch box the next day and clarify that we're still absolutely committed to the JCPOA. So mixed messages are not helpful either, and I'm afraid, let's not just start aping Donald Trump in the approach to international politics, because I think that would be a very bad road to go down. On domestic policy, yes, I think it's absolutely clear the strategy is for the Tories to park their tanks on our lawn. The fact is they're facing real economic problems. The UK economy only grew by 0.1% in the 3 months to December.
Good point, yeah.
That there is a creaking infrastructure. There's a massive chasm between London and the southeast and the rest of the country. And I also think there's ideological division in the Conservative Party. Let's not forget that Boris Johnson's Chancellor, Sajid Javid, is an out-and-out Thatcherite. He's a libertarian, free market, has the answer to everything Tory. So is Boris Johnson going to actually be able to reconcile those ideological differences within his own party and parliamentary party?
It's interesting, actually. I was speaking to a Tory MP who you might classify in that camp about the Flybe Rescue, and this MP said it showed 3 things: 1, that it's not an economically liberal government; 2, that they're willing to step in to save jobs in areas which they care about; and 3, that the Treasury wasn't going to stop it.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, and with all the threats of a reshuffle coming down the road, I can see why Sajid Javid might be deeply uncomfortable with some of this stuff. Just when I look at, as I read his political philosophy and large numbers of Conservatives, they believe in a small state. So, but Boris Johnson has this 80-seat majority. Some of the seats that have come in that they haven't held since the 1930s. This is changing the DNA of the Conservative Party potentially, or will it create a deeper kind of fissure in the party? I think it's not going to be all plain sailing, and I also think we've got to point out when we see the hypocrisy, this one nation thing. When the mask slips, when you look at what they did on the withdrawal agreement, removing protecting rights for refugees, removing workers' rights, no real realism there around a level playing field, provisions on environmental standards, consumer standards. When the mask slips, you do see, I think, another side to Boris Johnson coming out. And the big question is, how effectively will they be able to also deliver, because expectations are incredibly high, and they're talking about massive change in terms of infrastructure and industrial policy, but these things take time to come through the system, and if they are knocked off course by a Brexit that goes badly wrong because it shrinks the British economy, then there's going to be a very different debate, I think, going on in British politics.
Rachel Johnson's playing clever politics as well straight away, calling for cross-party talks on social care within 100 days.
So that would be by the end of March. So that would obviously new Labour leader comes in April 4th. So it forces all of the Labour leadership candidates to make a decision as well. Social care costs a lot of money, and we've got people like the Alzheimer's Society suggesting 40 billion could come out of the families of Alzheimer's or dementia sufferers by the time of the next election. So it's a massive cost. Experts are saying 10 billion needed now. All there was in the Conservative manifesto was an extra billion a year for councils and the continuation of the social care precept. So it's a lot of money, and people will need to make a decision on what to do, and it forces people in the Labour Party to consider if they're going to continue to offer, as they did at the election, free stuff, and what kind of corner that pushes them into. So, it might be more difficult for Labour than it might be for the Conservatives at the minute.
Yeah, he's kind of kicked the ball into the other side of the court, really, hasn't he, to mix my sporting?
Yeah, yes. Well, he has, on the level playing field. I mean, the interesting thing, though, about this Johnsonism is that actually, and you talked to someone yesterday and you put it in your piece, didn't you, is there's this interesting idea, which is it will be almost like a tiger economy once we've left Brexit. And tiger economies, what they're famous for, they have a chunk of protectionism to keep them healthy, to start off a nascent economy. And then once the protectionism sort of slowly wound down, then they open themselves to free markets, and they could have, South Korea is a very good example. Yeah. You don't just go hell for leather, open your markets, get swamped by everyone else. You have a chunk, and China certainly does it. So you protect your economy, and that's why
in key areas.
In key areas, not overall. You make sure that you're an open economy in lots of other ways, but you can see that working. And I think that as a strategy, as I say, that's almost Brownite in some ways. But Rachel's absolutely right. I think over time, things like bread and butter issues like council cuts, which are baked in to the spending plans, and I can't see them getting out of them unless they have a big change in their taxation policy to put money into local councils. That kind of stuff will really eat away at Tory support over time, I think, because if you do see your youth centre still closing, your Sure Start still closing, you're thinking, hold on, what's this all about? And that's where I would have thought a new Labour leader could be quite effective. However, they could be. I wouldn't put it out of the question that Boris could, late the second half of a term, suddenly find loads of money for councils and loads of money for all the stuff that will help him and get re-elected. So, it's not easy.
Yeah, Stephen, what did you make of the Flybe Rescue? Because obviously you've been lobbying on behalf of Port Talbot Steelworks for a number of years now. Would you like to see similar measures taken now? Boris Johnson's set a precedent, has he, in terms of stepping in?
I've always felt that the British government within the EU did far less than it could. If you look at the way that the French and the Germans and the Italians operate, they do aid industry. They do make sure they have a public procurement policy which is actually going to deliver value for local providers. They know how to play the game, and we always had this culture in this country of gold plating EU regulations and then blaming the EU when in fact it's all about the way it's interpreted. So if we can interpret the rules, and of course then it depends on what sort of Brexit we have, and that goes back to the conversation about convergence and particularly state aid. But okay, if we do have a completely isolated approach to state aid in terms of isolating ourselves from the EU system, then I suppose there is more scope for government intervention. But actually, when you talk to steelworkers, they do not want to be treated like a charity. They don't want to be subsidised by it to the hilt. They know that they make the best steel that money can buy. But they've had one hand tied behind their back because we've had such a lack of industrial strategy, so little support for research and development. Energy costs twice as much as our competitors. No public procurement straight, and dumping from China, where the UK government was actually a ringleader of a group of countries that were stopping the EU taking more harsh measures against China to stop the dumping. So, let's see. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. Let's see if all of this rhetoric is going to be converted into reality about having a more active state. The thing that's a great regret to me is we could have had a more active state within the EU context with no problem whatsoever. But now all those excuses have gone. All of that scapegoating the European Union has gone. And now it is a full focus on Boris Johnson to deliver what he said he's going to deliver. Expectations are extremely high. And in politics, sometimes people say you should overpromise and underpromise and overdeliver. Underpromise and overdeliver. It looks to me like Boris Johnson is at great risk of doing the opposite of that, of overpromising and underdelivering.
Do you think there was a particularly strong case for Flybe's rescue?
I think with Flybe, the big question there is the reason for their almost collapse because of mismanagement, because of poor leadership? Then if that is the case, then I think it's right for the government to step in and support. But that support needs to be very strongly conditional on seeing a proper business plan and a management strategy that's going to turn the business around, and that should be time-bound. And if they haven't delivered to that within those constraints and time limits, then I think you can't you can't treat business like a charity, because in the end, that is never going to work.
You can't have this bizarre state-run regional airline at the end of the day, can you?
No, you can't. And whatever happens with Brexit, you even can end up then in contravening WTO terms. So even if we end up on the hardest of hard Brexit, which is WTO also has rules on state aid. So if you end up contravening WTO rules on state aid, then you've got to withdraw the state aid. And if the business is floating only on the basis of state aid, that is an extremely risky and precarious place to be, and that's not good for anybody in terms of their jobs and their livelihoods. So I would say, very large strings need to be attached to any government support.
Well, it's going to be a really interesting few months ahead, I'm sure. But now it's time for the quiz.
Yay, we love the quiz.
And we couldn't get through the podcast without mentioning Big Ben.
Oh my God.
So this week's quiz is all about Big Ben.
I thought it was going to be about bongs.
Just pipe up with the answer when you know what it is. First one's quite easy. In 2017, which MP was spotted weeping as Big Ben bonged for a final time before renovations?
Was it
Steve Pound.
Oh, I thought it was Mark Francois.
Yes, it was Stephen
I was there, took a video of him.
Yeah.
This guy's going to clean the floor with us.
No!
He just
He lost last week to Rachel Reeves.
Rachel Reeves. Smashing
Right,
it.
now the pressure's really on.
Yeah.
So Stephen Pound, it was Stephen Pound, the Labour MP. He told me the day before, while I was on the Sunday shift,
that he was going to cry.
Gig, that he was going to hold a vigil with colleagues, and they'd gather around with their heads bowed but hope in their hearts.
We missed him.
Sure enough, he turned up. I'm not sure there was anyone else there.
We missed Pound.
Second one. In 1940, the silent minute was introduced. What was it, and what time was it?
God, I don't know.
1940.
No idea. Silent
Something
minute.
to do with the war.
Yeah.
Crikey. Was it that it didn't bong at midnight because in the middle at midnight, but it bonged at midday because of bombers coming over? And
No, it's not close enough.
No. So
Because of air raids of some kind? I don't know.
It is war-related.
Yeah, it's bound to be because of the war. That's as far as we've got.
Yeah, something to do with the war.
So, no,
go on, what's that?
so at 9 p.m. before the BBC radio news, the Big Ben would fall silent so that people could silently contemplate and pray for those on the battlefields.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Wow.
Final. Go on.
Did you know that during the war, Stormont was completely painted black so that bombers couldn't see it?
Oh, that is interesting.
Wow.
Wouldn't they
We
just
haven't
see a
talked about
massive
Stormont,
black?
so I thought I'd shoehorn it.
Well, they don't just see a massive black building, I guess, for night.
I like the way you do that, Rachel. You're worried you might not be able to answer any of these questions, so you thought you'd just plot something in.
I'm going to give you a point. That's a great fact. I'm going to give you a point. It's a draw.
I wonder if the Rolling Stones were inspired by that, painted black. No, it's going off somewhere else.
Yeah. Last question. What was dubbed the democracy lamp, and why was there a row over it?
Democracy lamp. Wow. Is this historic? This is old.
It's back to renovations, 2017.
2017. Democracy lamp. Come on, Stephen.
Well, I've
Come
just
on.
showed. How many questions did Rachel Reeves get right?
Well, we only have
Just
three.
asked.
She got two.
2 out of 3, to be fair.
I'm just nowhere.
Democracy lamp in 2017.
This is hard, though. You can be
Yeah, yeah.
forgiven. This is hard.
Yeah, I'm going to ask.
What?
Rachel if
Democracy
these are
lamp?
questions are
What
easy.
on... I don't know.
Don't know.
Struggling.
No
Is there a light within Big Ben or something?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Yeah, it's on top of Big Ben.
Right.
It's the Ayrton light. Oh. And ever since the Second World War, it has shined when Parliament is sitting. And maybe just one MP got very exercised about the fact it was going to be off during the renovations.
Right.
And the Telegraph did a classic enraged MPs piece. Nigel Evans told the Telegraph, health and safety laws have achieved what nobody other than the Luftwaffe has done since the Second World War. Turning off this light is one step too far.
That's a classic.
Was he humming the tune to the Dam Bus? Whilst he said that, yeah. From the back benches.
Right, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you to my guests for joining me, and make sure you subscribe to Commons People on all the usual channels so you can catch us every Thursday. And be sure to get your daily dose of the latest politics news by signing up to the War Zone newsletter at bit.ly/the-war-zone, or follow the link in the episode notes. We'll just leave you with the most ridiculous moment of the entire Big Ben saga so far, when ITV's This Morning had a young girl called Phoebe come on the show and come up with her idea for replacing the bongs. Here she is.
Okay, off you go.
Bim bom bim bom, bim bom bim bom, bim bom bim bom, bim bom bim bom.
Very good.